Right. Good afternoon, my friends. Good to be back here with you again. Uh, Good to be geeking out again. It's just something I've missed. Hope you guys had a good summer.
Best
We are
summer.
best summer ever.
Yeah.
We are going to be discussing Adam Grant's book, Think Again, and its implications for software developers. We're going to be starting a series where we're going to work our way through the whole book. Today, we're just going to talk about the prologue. And I think it's going to be interesting. I have read the book now and have been very challenged as a technologist, as a trainer, thinking about how these things apply in my work cycle. This is not going to be like a straight up book review as much as it's going to be taking things that Adam Grant said, which Adam Grant is an organizational psychologist, and applying them to the software world where we hang out sometimes. One of the key ideas in the book was that in a world where knowledge increases and changes at an exponential rate, it's important not only to know things, but be willing to rethink things. And if that's true in the wider world, think how true it is in the software world, where there's a new JavaScript framework every 20 minutes. And somebody touting something as a best practice on Twitter,
Or something is dead.
or something is dead. Yeah, that whole idea. So I want to start with the question thrown out to you guys. What are some things that you've experienced in your career where there was something that formerly was a good idea, that it was a legit thing to do, and as things went on, because of context, because of new technology, whatever had been true in the past stopped being true.
Classic ESP.
We're just going to point to the junk pile of technology in our wake.
And what a pile it is.
The whole time he's doing it.
But you make fun of old technologies. There are things that at the time were legitimately good ideas. I'm gonna bring up one that's really gonna sound like a joke, but you guys will know what project I'm talking about. There was a window in time when teammates of ours worked on a project that had to do with image editing in a browser. And this was long enough ago that HTML tools to do that were pretty primitive. And so the right thing for the customer was to build it in Silverlight.
Damn.
Right. And that, I assume you guys would agree with me. Like that was the right decision for that moment.
Yeah.
Knowing what we knew at the time.
That moment, that team, the only other comparable thing that I could think of at the time would be Flash, and that was soon to be dead as well.
Right. At that time, I think Flash and Silverlight still were seen very much as valid products.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Microsoft was trying to make it sound like this is the future. Although every time you heard them talk about it, they're like, and it also makes the browsers do this that they currently don't do yet. And I feel, at least for me, that was like the biggest sign that they are just creating a Band-Aid for something that is somewhat difficult to do in the browser. And
yeah, so they just left out the word immediate before future.
Yes, very much so.
It's technically the future.
Mm-hmm.
For now. Yeah, we could look back on any, especially as far as technologies, any of those choices that are impossible to make in the time because you don't know what's going to happen next, industry wide, and it becomes more of a it's not that you have to choose the right tool that's going to be future proof to begin with. I feel like the message all right away from the book is make your choice and then stay on your toes and then be ready, for when the browsers can do this and when you have to put Silverlight to bed.
Yeah, I remember having those discussions in and this is going to sound a lot of like I'm probably wrong, but I was not pro Silverlight from the beginning, and like it was very clear that HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript were very much the future. And I remember being in a many a meeting and saying, "This is the wrong choice. You need to learn these three things because you're not going to be in a good spot if you don't." And they're like, "No, this is the future." And my at least in the technology world, I have always leaned or kind of recognized that the arc of history for technology bends and tends towards standards, and when you have standards that like are coming out or being developed that the wider industry hasn't been able to like adopt yet, that seems to uh, open the door for a lot of people to try and fill the niches as quickly as possible, and so you can be above the or ahead of the curve for doing some task. And yeah, like
I feel like the counter argument to what you're saying is XHTML,
I don't know.
right? Because you have to put yourself in that historical context. HTML4 is a big thing,
Mm-hmm.
but the standards body all wanted to move towards HTML. Like there's a long period of time where it looked like that was the future. And that's also the time when Flash came to prominence because XHTML was so slow in coming.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a standard. It eventually died. And so
Mm-hmm.
then HTML5 is the next thing by that standards body. And so if I'm remembering the historical moment correctly, I think there was a lot of doubt. There was reason to doubt that HTML5 was going to be successful.
There was, I mean, so you say XHTML, I say XKCD, where you have the one where like there are 15 competing standards. Let's add another, some technology
Mm-hmm.
all together. And the last panel, of course, is there are 16 competing standards. And what you had with, I mean, competing standards is of course the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't, I don't know. You may have some prescience on HTML5, but it never makes it there's no flawless decision.
No, yeah.
Standards, it's probably a good idea, but then you have the which standard problem.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if they're up and coming, if they're competing, you can't know. And that's the essence of our industry, is you can't know. So, what are you going to do about that problem? Not try to solve the problem that you can't know.
Went over the biggest community.
But to piggyback on John's point, and to try and tie this back to the book, it's important sometimes to recognize you can't know. And then it's also important sometimes to recognize that what you used to know might not be true anymore. Mm-hmm. And we could dump on technologies all day, which actually might be fun.
Yeah.
But I also want to take a swing at this from a process standpoint, or even a methodology standpoint. Like, what are the things that maybe in the past were like things that were truisms or were true but aren't true anymore of software?
Don't use JavaScript in the browser. I think that one is pretty top of mind every time I look at SPA applications and what they can do now.
From a process standpoint, I would say it used to be okay. It used to be okay to wait until you were done coding to test your software. Because you theoretically had enough time before the market was ready for the next version where you could do that.
And I think there was also that, I think that's somewhat tied to distribution methods. I think there are a lot of things, if you go back far enough in software, that are true, where you have to ship software on a physical medium, which
In a
means
box, on a truck,
right,
in a store.
which the media costs money, the box costs money, like that's all money. And so by shipping more often, there is increased expense. So the optimization function is to try and reduce that. And so there's a lot of things, especially in older advice, like, hey, we have to test this a lot before we ship it, because there's like one canonical set of ones and zeros that is the software that we can test. And we need to make sure we get it right before we burn it onto CDs or whatever it is that we're going to do.
Yeah, because you're not going to be able to update it.
Or at least not without a huge expense.
Mm-hmm.
Another related idea is sort of the notion that the people testing the software should not talk to the people who made the software, because then they'll be testing it properly and not thinking, not caught up in the same context that the people who made it were. And therefore, they'll have their red hat on properly. I still hear, I haven't been on a team that did that sort of outsourced their testing, but I've seen remnants of people who worked like that for a long time and did get the idea stuck that the developers and testers shouldn't talk.
Yeah, I think I've been at clients that had that point of view.
Yeah, I had a client more than a decade ago, and so I'm going to assume that this has changed, but at that time the FDA required that there be communication isolation between the software development team and the final validation team. Yeah. And there were a lot of things in that just made the process unbelievably inefficient. I understand the reason for it. I mean, the reason was that they wanted to make sure that the validation team had different financial incentives than the development team. But as a developer in that effort, it's like, man, like I got this bug report and all I want to do is go have a conversation with whoever found it. And we were prevented from doing so.
There's also, along the same vein, that developers shouldn't talk to business people. That like your PM or whoever's gathering the requirements has already gotten the requirements. There's no ambiguity there. Whatever it says in your document is what you should do.
Yeah, there's some different reasoning behind that versus the coders versus testers. What were the reasons given for that you remember?
I think it's centered around potentially the developers trying to solve the problem before they understood it, or because the developers had been shielded from the business forever, they didn't really understand the business. So the developers would just keep asking questions to better understand what they were trying to solve, and the business would just get tired of answering questions that don't make sense to them, or I mean, make sense, but just like seem trivial to them. When in hindsight, by discussing all those things out, the developers could see potentially a different way to solve the problem that would be infinitely better, faster, and make things easier.
Ideally, then one thing I always go to is the like the nose picker problem. Like these people write code in the theoretically in a dark office in a basement somewhere, and we can't let them see the customer because that's embarrassing. But
yeah,
and the other thing is, it's more related to what you said, was kind of the end run around, like as soon as the customer gets a hold of a developer's email or phone number, they get whatever they want right away in the software, and this developer gets distracted from the project plan to solving business problems.
Yeah, you got to side load a whole helping of side creep or scope creep when you do that. And plus, I think that goes beyond just that scope creep, but like support after the fact. So if the project is done, the client can just keep calling you and sending you messages. You don't really know what the priority is or how to deflect those requests.
Yeah. And now I'm just hung up on the phrase, if the project is done. Like, nonsense in 2022.
Yep. No, that wasn't the case back then, though, or at least people's perceptions.
Yeah.
So one of the other ideas in the prologue to this book was actually a story of a firefighter who's, I believe his name was Wagner Dodge. Am I getting that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He was a smoke jumper. He and his team were out fighting a wildfire, and then the wind shifted direction, and so all of a sudden the wildfire was coming at them. And so literally they're like running away. He and his team are running away from a wildfire. And the tragic part of the story is that many of the team lost their lives. This guy survived not because he was able to outrun the fire, but because kind of on the fly he comes up with a solution where he starts throwing lit matches into the grass ahead of him.
He's actually lighting more fire.
Yeah, lighting more fire, a smaller fire, which then creates a place where it's all charred earth already, so the wildfire can't burn to where, once he's in that spot, it can't burn to him. Kind of on the fly invents a way to save his own life, which is truly remarkable.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know what you guys think are what are the parallels? Like, what are the ways we apply that as developers?
Why would you light more fire to fight a fire? Is the same as why would you write a test for code that doesn't exist yet? There's a little bit of the same, obviously a different magnitude of problem, but it's the same kind of counterintuitive nonsense that gets you actually to a solution.
And to take that to another level, Sandy Metz, I think she's a Ruby developer. She has one video, and I can't remember what the video was titled, but she talks about refactoring, and she talks about and shows graphs of sometimes you to get from one plateau to another, you have to show you have to get very, very disorganized before you can get better. And that disorganization and getting way more disorganized before you even start seeing the downward slope that is going to get you to a better spot, that is really counterintuitive, and I feel like that extra disordered state of your code, I feel like that's the matches that you're throwing into the fire to be able to get you to a safer, better spot.
Yeah, I mean, there's you can get tied really wrapped around the axle, thinking about architectural principles and organization of your code while you're still writing your code, while you're still solving the problem and understanding what the code's going to look like. And most of the time, when I watch developers who haven't grasped this yet, they're still they're trying to apply everything all at once instead of just making a mess and then taking the time to clean up the mess, which is really, that's the only way that I've ever found to make quality code happen that actually works.
Yeah. And I
mean, you have to code that works and say, now I'm going to mess this up. I'm going to refactor. I'm going to rethink my code.
And I think that maps very well to one of the diagrams in the book, where it's titled "Things We Cling to: Assumptions, Instincts, Habits, and then Having an Open Mind." And it's a pie chart that has the first three taking up 1/3 of each, and then like having an open mind, not even in the picture. And it is, I feel like that is really emblematic of, that's how you start out being a developer. And as you get more experience doing, working on problems, working on projects, different projects in different states. Sometimes they're really good, sometimes they're not, and learning that, okay, well, this part isn't necessarily the best spot, or in the best spot, but I can work with this, and maybe with the someone suggesting, hey, what if we go change this? And it might not have been something that you thought about. And actually taking some time to digest and think about how that's going to contribute to things. I feel like we have done a really good job when we work together of ensuring that we had an open mind and reminding each other when we didn't have an open mind. And it was really cool.
Yeah.
Well, let me throw a question back at you guys, because we're talking about, it seems counterintuitive sometimes to refactor code that may be working. But let's frame it this way. What is the value of that refactoring? Like, why do that? Why are we right that refactoring is a good thing to do?
From my standpoint, it's because it makes the code more maintainable. If you have the freedom to change the code under the hood, and you have the confidence in your tests and the other tests that you build around that, it makes your code more evolvable and less fragile, less scary.
Why is that important? Why is it important that it's maintainable? We're just building.
Because it's software is software for a reason, and if you can't feel like you can make changes to the code, that your code isn't soft anymore. It's not adapting to your changing situation. If Access database was like the top of the line database, and that's the only database anybody is ever going to need, they would have just created a hardware appliance that put it into hardware that could not change, and that would be what we all run on a USB stick or something like that.
So where does that get you, Eric, on your question?
So I think what we're driving at, I know we all agree on this, like the highest virtue really is delivering valuable software to our clients, to our users. And so what I want to tie this back to with the firefighter story is that you have a whole team of people, and all but one of them thought that their highest virtue was to outrun the fire to the ridge. And to be fair, they had been trained in running with gear on. And so they fell back to their training like, man, I just have to run.
Mm-hmm.
Dodge realizes that the real goal here is not a foot race to the ridge. This is wanting to not be consumed by the wildfire. And he realizes that if he starts a fire that he can survive, a smaller brush fire, that he'll achieve the larger outcome. And so I think the parallel here is that when we say, well, our highest virtue as software developers is develop working valuable software to clients, specifically in situations where businesses change, context change, everything changes. If the context changes, then for the software to remain valuable, it needs to change. And so then refactoring or taking time to clean code, or all these kind of things that developers should love, like they serve that purpose. I think one of the things that we see sometimes, you have people in development organizations that like lose sight of that further goal. Like, so if Dodge's further goal was to survive, and is one of the ways to achieve that was outrunning the fire, right? In software, so well, our goal is to provide working software, but to do that, we have to type a bunch of code. And so anything that we do that prevents us from typing the maximum amount of code is wrong, right? Like, so people get like, people, I don't even say like maliciously sometimes have these wrong ideas. They just get focused on the wrong goals and can't adjust, can't rethink, to use Adam Grant's phrase, that there might be ways that start out looking like starting a small fire, but in the end actually achieve the goal that you want.
Yeah, and malicious, hardly ever.
Right. Yeah.
Hardly ever. And, no matter what it feels like, or, I believe that everybody is getting out of bed, intending to do well.
Good. Yeah.
To do good
with the best of intentions.
Right. Everybody's trying to fix the problem that they see. They just are seeing different problems.
Yep. And to that end, I want to read a little section of the book. He starts out saying, why would so many firefighters cling to a set of tools, even though letting go might save their lives? If you're a firefighter, dropping your tools, it doesn't just require you to unlearn habits and disregard instincts. Discarding your equipment means admitting failure and shedding part of your identity. You have to rethink your goal in your job and your role in life. And I feel like when we talk about people getting out of bed and making choices and whatnot, and everybody wanting to do good, I feel like we are missing the identity part of that. I feel like a lot of developers or engineers or architects look at and have an identity about what they do, and that putting down an IDE or a framework or a language to solve something in a way that doesn't require those things is very scary, and that's like putting down part of your identity. Like, if I can't solve it using this thing, what good am I? Just because you have a hammer and you can hit that hammer on everything that you can see doesn't mean that you should hit everything that you see with that hammer.
This hits home for me, and I don't know if you guys might be surprised by this, but since joining Industrial Logic, I've something I picked up is that I don't really use Scrum anymore. Something like this is a tool that I've put down. If I encounter a team that's using Scrum, I'll know my way around, because I used to take a team that was using Scrum and draw them further into Scrum. Like, okay, this is the way you want to go. If you want to use Scrum, you got to use it like it says in the guide, and adhere to these things, and do Scrum if you're going to do Scrum. And these days I would meet the same team. I might reference the guide for a couple of things, to help them out, but ultimately I would lead them away from it. I would lead them towards something more effective.
More bespoke for the team and the problem?
Usually, bespoke, but also, there's smaller things than frameworks. There's principles that can be applied and are more malleable. They're smaller Legos, essentially. Instead of bringing a whole Lego castle and saying you have to live in the castle, I can bring in a couple of key bricks and show them how to put the bricks together, and so that's a common thing that especially people in my seat, agilists, get attached to their tools all the time. It's a sickness.
Not just agilists, all software developers.
Yeah.
Yes, all like it was scary when I left the company that we worked for, and I went on to a different place. It was a completely different tech stack than what I had been using, a different framework, and I was moving into a lot of different areas, and it is just a little bit scary, but it is way more exciting than anything that I've done in recent memory, and it feels really good. And I have learned, and I've talked to people that learn to recognize when you're feeling a little bit scared, feel the anxiousness, and when you feel the anxiousness, run to that.
Yes.
Because that's where you know you're moving forward, and that's where you are learning, where you are problem solving, where you are really achieving stuff.
I think that's a really beautiful way to tie it back. That whole principle of like, what am I afraid of? And use that as a compass, and that ties exactly into the Wagner Dodge story. He's running from fire, so he makes a fire. It's it's metaphorical, I guess, but
yeah, it still applies.
That's huge.
Sweet.
All right. Well, I think that is an excellent place to put a bow on this conversation. We'll be back next week with a discussion on chapters 1 and 2, I believe, of Think Again, and how that applies to us as software development professionals.
We're just getting started.
Just getting started.
Merely a prologue.
Yeah.
All right. Adios.
See ya.